studies on the Asia-Pacific region.
Particularly Japan.
Particularly Japan. And I'll let Maureen take over.
And I'm not mentioning Japan.
You're not.
But rather I am feeding off and into James's talk on wars and illegal wars, and my line of inquiry concerns our thinking about wars. We've just heard what Australian governments have successively done. What is the kind of thinking that drives that and sustains that? We, the people of Australia, ultimately are complicit in that. Governments have powerful influence over the information that we receive, the understandings that we form about wars and what they're doing. So I think it's useful to unpack the thinking about wars. So I guess I'm telling you about my thinking about our thinking about war and government thinking about war. In my thinking about this, I came to realise, of course, there's a certain thinking which is dominant, a certain type of war thinking. I think, for me, a way of explaining it is as a paradigm, a dominant paradigm. A paradigm is effectively like a set of concepts and ideas and constructs, but it also has a normative aspect. It's how we value and appreciate. And to understand how the government has got away with fostering wars as it has promoted a paradigm, a way of thinking that accepts, tolerates this kind of disastrous thinking. And I say disastrous because ultimately it is disastrous for we the people of this country, as well as the millions who've been killed in the process. Yeah. Governments are, of course, powerful in creating our national story, mythology, through hardware, institutions, and through software such as stories. The narrative that governments have continued to promote, I think, is one that desensitises us. It breeds a culture where we are less aggrieved by, have capacity to empathise with those who suffer rather than those who are glorified in war. So I will look first at what is the thinking, the dominant paradigm, the stories, what are the messages that inform us through this thinking? How is that thinking embedded through hard mechanisms and through soft mechanisms, and why? And I think I don't really need to talk about why, because James has just given us all the answers, that the litany of disgraceful war efforts that this kind of thinking has sustained. So I might just bypass the one. Let's see how we go. Okay, so the dominant narrative, the dominant thinking. James referred to, we are treated to fictions. Indeed we are, and I think right now we're treated ever more constantly to really powerful fictions, narratives, stories that militarise our consciousness, our thinking. They're sustained by false narratives, as James has explained. This thinking is a story to construct, well, the present, but also to explain our past, our national past, one that speaks of military glory, the valour of service, the courage of men at war. So it glorifies war, and it silences the impact of war on us and on others, particularly those who've been slaughtered in Australia and outside. That kind of thinking, narrative, is to sustain a national culture that accepts war and war-happy governments as legitimate, as serving our national interests, even though we're not ever advised what those interests actually are. Rather, we're told this is about, securing the nation, all of which sounds quite laudable. Unfortunately, it's a fiction. These stories are about how Australian men, generally men, have fought. They aren't about why. I think it's important to unpack our thinking, because right now, this kind of message that's coming across through national narratives, national stories, is helping to inure mainstream thinking to what is effectively the militarisation of the dominant national stories, and therefore the militarisation of national thinking and acceptance of ever deeper military engagement. So, thinking and government getting its thinking across. Let's start with hardware. Okay. There are lots of institutionalised arrangements through which the government propagates militarised thinking. And of course I use the term loosely, but I'll accept that you understand generally where I'm coming from. The government makes regular appeals to national security, national defence, as if a military program was going to secure us, as if other things are not foremost in our national security. Of course, it does so to legitimise the militarisation of our institutions and our culture. Government hardware through secrecy. I think James mentioned it's actually difficult to access information about war. It's institutionalised, we are denied access to it and locked out. Concoctions about terrorists, terrorist threats, particularly important because threats are about the cultivation of fear, and fear is great validation for upping the military ante and increasing surveillance of us, which is really disastrous in my view. I think at so many turns too, it is about the language that the government uses in its stories. For example, it speaks of the weapons industry, the defence industry. How can defence be an industry? It can be an industry when you have the current national government telling us that it wants to position us amongst one of the top 10 military exporters. Okay. What other hardware? I think, as James mentioned, there's effectively no parliamentary debate about wars. It's just not on the agenda. It's not discussed. So, silence. For example, as James mentioned about Australia in Iraq. James also mentioned our leaders are not accountable. They can begin wars, they can prosecute wars in our name, but are not necessarily accountable to us. For example, John Howard and Blair and Bush in the Coalition of the Willing. Eventually Tony Blair did have to attempt to validate, he had to account for his position. John Howard? No accounting. They're off the hook. Our official representatives. For example, Peter Cosgrove, who is a former senior army officer, also happens to be the Governor-General. What does that tell you about iconography? And as James mentioned too, Jim Molan, Senator who was a commander in Fallujah, and as James mentioned, in his view, unquestionably committing war crimes, as it happens, I have this quote from Greg Sheridan, who, as we know, is savagely conservative, writing in The Australian. He says, Jim Molan offers lessons in courage for the gutless Greens in their grotesque attack on Major General, brackets, retired, Jim Molan. That informs our thinking. Furthermore, says Greg Sheridan, Jim Molan is one of the bravest and most important soldiers that Australia has produced in the last 40 years. That informs the thinking of some of us who don't think critically about the newspapers that we choose to read or what's in them. In terms of hardware, we have key players like weapons industries that are actually empowered. The prospect is to offer them incentives to produce, to bolster the weapons export industry, rather than ever more firmly regulated, as I think we in the room would agree. Another mechanism, demonising peace activists. Indeed, illegalising peace activists, such as some at Pine Gap. Perhaps many of you here were out on the streets in 2002 protesting against Iraq. Okay, we weren't squashed in any physical sense, but certainly squashed in receptivity to reach into policy making or government thinking. John Howard's response was no response, effectively. And I think, to some extent, it may have helped to neuter opposition to wars as expressed in the street. I would like to think I'm wrong, but maybe I'm not. Another example, Julian Assange, who has actually been made a fugitive for revealing some of the illegal activities in Afghanistan and Iraq invasions. Others may have promoted him as a hero, an icon, in a different cultural setting. But in what is the current dominant paradigm, the current dominant way of thinking, he is shut out, made fugitive, if not effectively declared illegal. Okay, so how this paradigm, this thinking is embedded through hard mechanisms. Now let's turn to how it's embedded through soft mechanisms. Soft institutionalising through messages, stories, mythologies, iconography. As James has mentioned, so many histories of this country, particularly this country's military past, are riddled with lies, inaccuracies. What does that do to our thinking about the past of this country? The media. It's compromised and subservient. Its war coverage is consistent with the dominant war narrative, generally. Media, I think, contributes to impoverishing public debate about the issue of war and militarisation of this country. The media does not cultivate a deeply engaged and critical conversation among us and amongst those who would feed our thinking. Another soft mechanism, popular culture, particularly its proclivity for entertainment, rather than focusing on matters that may be of more serious concern and distressing. I think there are many who find it easier, more comfortable to divert towards entertainment, film. But then, if we think about the kind of films that are out, films that glorify war, for example, a film on Churchill, who again James has mentioned, I happened to see that film because I had to get out of the house, but as I saw it, it was rather a glorified version. It was deeply sanitised. There was not really an insinuation of the crimes to which others may find him guilty. Another soft mechanism, iconography. Particularly, for example, the Australian War Memorial, which is said to commemorate the fallen. If one is familiar with the memorial, effectively it is glorifying wars of our colonial past, our empire past. It does not consider the tragic wars of white settlers over Indigenous Australians, over Aboriginal people, to dispossess them of their land. So it blots out the damage that our forebears have inflicted upon these people. And we don't see it, and neither does anyone else. It informs our thinking about our military past by its absence. It's not there, so effectively it doesn't inform our thinking. It's not part of our understanding. The War Memorial lauds Aboriginals who fought for empire, but not those who resisted empire. Informs our thinking. Also, on the Australian War Memorial, a couple of years back, I think it was around the time of Anzac, it accepted funding for commemorations from, would you believe, arms manufacturers. And that was all okay because it was to, help memorialise the country in the views of those who sustain that position. But of course, which was not said, it also works to keep Australia permanently at war. The irony that runs through that is almost pure. Okay. Mythologising around the national story. Sentimental stories, emotive stories, but they're nationalistic, and they are to commemorate, remember, and legitimise war. To some extent, they're like secular religions. Typical of military mythology, and generally the line of these stories is how Australians have fought. The soldiers are strong and courageous and they served faithfully. They are not stories of why Australians have fought, because generally it wasn't to serve Australia's interests, and as we've heard from James, there are all sorts of other reasons which have nothing to do with the interests of this country. These stories are to divert attention from really what are the costs of war, the sacrifice, the loss, the destruction, the tragedy, the absence of national interest. Importantly, I think, in terms of thinking, they are to desensitise us, to normalise war and a military culture. I think they're to prevent our capacity to empathise with those who have lost so much. And, as I think James has mentioned, they are about delusions, to delude us from what is really going on and has been going on in our name for a long time. Why? Since we're running out of time, we might just accept that James has given us so many reasons to explain why governments, arms industries and so forth have an interest in fostering and cultivating this way of thinking. But it does have a consequence, and the consequence is a rather deluded public, a public that is desensitised to the atrocities of war, a public that is ever more vulnerable to warmongering governments, as we have heard recently with the proposal to make this country a more extensive arms manufacturer. So let me wrap this. I began by referring to this as a struggle over the dominant paradigm. A paradigm insofar as it involves not just thinking, but values and stories. A paradigm that promotes, embeds and sustains the acceptance of war. And yes, it is about power. But to end on a positive note, because this is about power, we have power too. We have power to live ourselves as sources of peace, to engage with others in dialogues of peace, to help correct misunderstandings about our past. So, on that note, yes, here's to a culture of peace and our efforts to help produce that. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Maureen. I think that was a really good sort of balance on,